So, good afternoon, everyone. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. This is going to be one of those weird blue bonnets presentations where I'm going to go from French to English, and the young people in the room have no idea what I'm talking about. We'll explain afterwards. Donc, c'est un plaisir de vous accueillir ici cet après-midi. Je me présente Nicolas Vermeil, je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche en droit public. A pleasure to welcome you this afternoon. My name is Nicolas Vermeil. I am the director of the Centre de recherche en droit public, roughly translated Public Law Research Institute, although not exactly the right term. I'm going to stay in English for the rest of these presentations. Otherwise, I'm not going to end presentations before the end of this conference. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you online and those of you who are able to join us in person to this roundtable discussion on this brand new book that just came out, Academic Freedom. For the people online, it's a little bit far, but you can Google it and find the cover of it. Academic Freedom in a Plural World, edited by our friend and colleague NANDINI RAMANUJA and her colleague FREDERIC. So it is a pleasure to welcome speakers that are going to be here this afternoon to discuss the book, all of which have contributed to this book. So very quickly, because I don't want to spend too much time on presentations and invite them to complete their biographies afterwards. So Nandini, as I mentioned, is a friend and colleague, a researcher at the CRDP, but also the co-director and the program director of the Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism at McGill. FREDERIC MEGRET is the James S. Carpenter Visiting Professor of Law at Columbia Law School. Thank you for joining us. Angela Campbell is the interim deputy provost at McGill Law and obviously also a professor at McGill Law. And so these are the people on my left. And on my right, the closest one to me is TAMARA THERMITUS, who is the senior Bolton fellow at McGill. Next to her is Sophie BISPING, who is a former student at McGill and now a student at the bar here in Quebec. So good luck with that. We know it's unfortunately a step you have to go through, not the most fun one, but we're confident that things will go very well for you. And last, but certainly not least, Jacob Levy, who is the Tomlinson Professor of Political Theory at McGill Political Science. So welcome to all of you. And I believe, Nandini, you will be first. No, I apologize. FREDERIC will be first to speak. So sir, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup de nous recevoir. C'est un grand plaisir d'être de retour à Montréal, même si c'est pour pas très longtemps. J'arrive, et comme on l'a mentionné, de l'université de Columbia, qui fait un petit peu figure de ground zero de liberté académique. Et quand on s'était lancé dans ce projet, j'avais pas du tout vocation à devenir cobaye dans cette espèce de vaste processus de réinvention de la non-liberté académique. Je vais pas épiloguer trop longtemps. Je vais peut-être repartir un peu sur notre intuition à l'origine avec Nandini quand on a commencé à parler de notre projet. Je pense qu'on ne pouvait pas déjà savoir à quel point la question n'allait que prendre de l'importance avec les mois qui passaient, à quel point on est aujourd'hui dans une situation qui me paraît tout à fait dramatique et pas seulement aux États-Unis. Mais il y avait deux intuitions principales. L'une était qu'il y avait un moment au début des années 2020, à la fin des années 2010, où un certain nombre de phénomènes convergeaient qui rendaient la question de la liberté académique, qui a toujours été à notre sens d'actualité, particulièrement d'actualité, une sorte de confluence d'événements, par ailleurs, il y avait une sorte de segmentation, une division du débat sur la liberté académique entre juristes, philosophes, praticiens, professionnels de l'université, etc., entre étudiants et professorat et administration, une césure entre la société au sens large et le monde universitaire. Et aussi, on pensait que Montréal serait particulièrement bien placé pour initier une réflexion sur ces questions, une césure entre le monde francophone, le monde anglophone, le Global North, le Global South, l'Est et l'Ouest. Et notre idée a été non pas bon, c'est un ouvrage collectif, donc il s'agissait de donner une certaine liberté à nos auteurs, non pas d'arriver à une sorte de formule parfaite de ce que devrait constituer ou de ce que constituait dans le moment la liberté académique, mais un peu une sorte d'instantané de ces tensions telles qu'elles pouvaient être perçues ici et ailleurs, plutôt dans l'idée de poser le problème et puis de souligner un petit peu les défis auxquels fait face la liberté économique. Alors, au cœur de la structuration du projet, il y a trois phénomènes qui nous paraissent, trois menaces qui nous paraissent clés. La première est plutôt classique, c'est la répression par les États, dans ce qu'on pourrait appeler les menaces sur la liberté académique autoritaires classiques. On a vu beaucoup ça en Turquie, en Hongrie, au Brésil, et on voit le phénomène gagner également l'Occident avec des tentatives politiques de reprendre en main les universités, notamment, bien sûr aux États-Unis, mais d'une manière ou d'une autre aux Pays-Bas, d'une certaine manière en France également. Et voilà, avec une sorte de caricature qui naît de l'université comme souvent dans les discours politiques, comme un espace obscurantiste qui devrait être sauvé de lui-même par l'entremise d'une intervention politique extérieure qui manipule un petit peu l'idée de liberté académique à son profit pour mieux en réalité la miner de l'intérieur. Deuxième phénomène, la répression sociale ou la répression notamment par les donateurs, par les acteurs du monde privé notamment dans des logiques assez corporatistes, néolibérales, où l'université est extrêmement vulnérable au financement extérieur. On voit ressurgir beaucoup, bien sûr aux États-Unis, la menace que la philanthropie se tarisse et des tentatives d'intervention dans la gouvernance universitaire sous menace de ne pas faire certains dons qui étaient attendus ou espérés, avec un vrai discours derrière ça, parfois relativement presque haineux à l'égard de l'université, extrêmement sceptique sur ce qu'elle a à apporter aux acteurs économiques, un discours de l'inutilité de l'université si elle n'est pas juste une machine à former des salariés. Et puis, troisième phénomène, une répression de l'intérieur. Alors ça, c'est un phénomène plus délicat et complexe à cerner, mais une tendance des universités à se dévorer elles-mêmes, à s'aborder leurs propres principes. J'en voudrais peut-être pour exemple à Columbia, dans ma propre faculté, des plaintes disciplinaires entre collègues qui mettent en jeu la liberté académique, une présidente de l'université qui livre en pâture certains de ses collègues lors d'audiences devant le Congrès. Le tout dans un contexte où souvent l'université elle-même peine à articuler avec conviction pourquoi est-ce qu'elle croit et pourquoi est-ce qu'elle devrait croire à la liberté académique. Donc les institutions qui devraient être parfois à la pointe de la revendication de cette liberté, parfois lui rendre un piètre service, et puis une critique de l'intérieur, notamment par les étudiants qui questionnent les bienfaits d'une certaine version libérale de la liberté académique, invoquant des notions d'identité, de vulnérabilité, le caractère politique de l'institution. Je dirais que dans cette confrontation, l'université est un peu seule. L'université telle qu'elle s'est conçue traditionnellement comme un espace de rencontre, de conversation, de transmission des savoirs, est particulièrement vulnérable, alors notamment à l'exécutif aujourd'hui aux États-Unis. On a d'un côté un espace, d'un autre côté un glaive. Hein, l'espace, c'est juste un espace. Finalement, ce qui définit l'université, c'est cette espèce d'ouverture, de réceptivité, etc. Et ça explique peut-être une sorte de démobilisation institutionnelle, parfois, que c'est difficile pour l'université d'être vraiment un bouclier, parce qu'être un bouclier, c'est aussi s'ériger et créer une barrière institutionnelle contre le monde extérieur d'ailleurs, qui va parfois un peu à l'encontre de l'instinct universitaire qui est plutôt de prêcher l'ouverture. Mais je le sens très fort en ce moment à Columbia, où tout le monde est en train de regarder l'administration pour dire, what the hell is going on? When is the response coming? And the response is not coming. La réponse, on a l'impression que tout le monde est paralysé. Alors, peut-être qu'il va y avoir un énorme procès qui va être annoncé dans 3 jours, mais on sent que institutionnellement, l'université peine dans l'espace politique actuel à convaincre le grand public de la nécessité de son autonomie et de sa liberté. Alors ça, c'était une première chose, faire un petit peu la cartographie de ces menaces. Moi, une chose qui m'intéresse beaucoup, c'est comprendre les pratiques de la répression et de la limitation de la liberté académique, qui sont dans des sociétés libérales qui forcément prennent des moyens détournés. C'est-à-dire que personne ne va jamais dire on n'est pas en Russie, on n'est pas... il faut y mettre les formes malgré tout. C'est encore peut-être ce qui distingue à peu près les sociétés libérales, c'est des qui ont complètement pris un tournant autoritaire. Mais alors, pêle-mêle, hein, juste comme élément de réflexion, bien sûr, l'attaque de l'autonomie de gouvernance des universités comme moyen d'éliminer leur indépendance, mais par des biais détournés. Donc, ça peut être à travers des exigences de rapports, d'audits, la mise en avant de critères techniques, par exemple les questions de sécurité, les questions on voit aussi aux États-Unis, les questions de non-discrimination qui sont élevées comme une sorte de fer de lance de l'intrusion dans les processus universitaires. Le définancement, des financements qui peut être graduel, qui peut être conditionnel. Enfin, on voit aux Pays-Bas, c'était un petit peu, il faut refaire la queue et redemander des financements, et des financements qui, au lieu d'être généraux, deviennent de plus en plus particuliers, donc project specific. Il y a de moins en moins de financement pour l'université en général. Donc l'exploitation de cette dépendance financière, les menaces individuelles sur ceux qui résistent avec, là on voit aux États-Unis, les cibles faciles, c'est des personnes avec un statut d'immigration précaire, donc ça va commencer comme ça, mais on sait que ça continuera au-delà. La remise en question des compétences et du mérite des personnes ayant été recrutées sur la base de programmes de diversité et d'inclusion. Donc on voit vraiment aujourd'hui aux États-Unis un backlash considérable envers tout recrutement soupçonné, qu'il l'ait été d'ailleurs ou pas, d'être issu d'efforts pour augmenter la diversité dans les universités. L'exagération des paniques autour de la vulnérabilité de certains étudiants, quand ça arrange, c'est-à-dire que la vulnérabilité des étudiants, d'un côté, elle est honnie, comme voilà, c'est tous ils sont trop sensibles, etc. Mais par ailleurs, dans certains contextes, on va vraiment au contraire, il faut absolument que l'université intervienne pour les protéger. L'interdiction de certains sujets comme étant trop divisive, comme étant problématiques, comme étant trop politiques. Le reproche que l'université elle-même fait trop de politique, que les étudiants sont trop politiques, que les professeurs sont trop politiques, ils devraient se concentrer sur ce qu'ils font mieux, mais sans jamais clarifier ce que c'est. La promotion de politiques de neutralité à tous les niveaux, neutralité institutionnelle, neutralité dans les salles de cours, l'intervention de la police pour déloger des étudiants, l'idée que l'espace universitaire est plus un espace comme ça de relative protection contre le reste de la société. Alors, je voudrais juste rajouter un point en dehors de ces grandes techniques de mise au pas de l'université, 3 dimensions importantes, peut-être pas entièrement évidentes dans ces processus. D'abord, une sorte de processus d'inversion où on va tenter en gros, réprimer la liberté académique au nom de la liberté académique. Donc, c'est par exemple les conservateurs américains qui se font les défenseurs de la liberté académique, y compris pour justifier des intrusions massives dans la gouvernance des universités, au nom de l'idée que les universités elles-mêmes ont abandonné leur idéal libéral classique de protection d'une diversité de voix. typiquement aux caricatures complètes et d'une incompréhension complète de ce que sont les universités dans leur réalité quotidienne, mais au terme d'une manœuvre qui est difficile à résister parce qu'elle se drape des principes qu'elle cherche en réalité à pourfendre. Et donc, on n'a pas forcément affaire à un autoritarisme classique, on a une sorte de faux libéralisme qui en réalité cache un autoritarisme conséquent. Deuxième dimension qui me paraît importante, c'est le chill factor. Le terme est overused, pour ainsi dire. Le chill factor, c'est vraiment très, très important. L'impression que finalement, il suffit... L'université, c'est un système complexe. Il suffit de contrôler 1 ou 2 points et on peut contrôler toute la machine. Ça me fait penser, après 1968, en France, les CRS s'étaient plaints de ce que la Sorbonne était un campus beaucoup trop ouvert et qu'on n'arrivait pas à contrôler rapidement les étudiants quand ils faisaient des manifestations. Et donc, on a construit le campus de Jussieu. Et Jussieu est un campus qui a été conçu par les architectes comme pouvant être fermé en 5 minutes par la police. Il y a 2 points d'entrée. Avec une espèce de dédale qui fait que... Et donc, cette idée de Jussieu, le campus, qu'on arrive à cadenasser très rapidement, me paraît important. Et troisième dimension, dernier point, la dimension transnationale qui reste éludée et qu'on a voulu, avec Nandini, souligner. Il y a quand même encore une sorte de nationalisme méthodologique. On a tendance à imaginer chaque problème de liberté académique comme avant tout ancré dans certaines dynamiques politiques internes. Et c'est vrai en partie. Mais ça, il y a 2 choses. D'une part, il y a une transmission des idées sur la répression académique d'un pays à l'autre. Hein, le playbook circule entre pays autoritaires. D'autre part, on a de plus en plus, et c'est un phénomène à notre avis très intéressant, une forme de répression transnationale de la liberté académique avec des États qui vont surveiller leurs étudiants à l'étranger, qui vont intervenir pour que des sujets géopolitiques sensibles ne soient pas abordés. On a beaucoup parlé à un moment de la Chine, en Australie, au Canada, etc. Des sujets qu'on ne peut plus toucher ou uniquement avec grande difficulté. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup pour ces propos introductifs et mes excuses de vous pousser comme ça. Nandini, voulez-vous ajouter quelques propos?
Oui, merci à Sylvain et Angela et au CRDP de nous réunir pour cette conversation importante. I'm not going to take, Fred has covered quite a bit of, our ideas behind the book. I just wanted to underscore a few things, what led us to this project and why it is more important than ever before. So our work as a center for now a decade and a half with organizations dedicated to protecting academics escaping persecution from different parts of the world was one such impetus for the book. And it was not an abstract idea that we enjoy so much freedom compared to so many people from different parts of the world, because we hosted people from Ethiopia and Iran and from Russia, and their lives were upended overnight. So much so that they escaped overnight, as people are now either being sent away or escaping from the US. So, and we hosted them for a couple of years. We learned a great deal from them. So we recognize that what a privilege we have where we are to pursue ideas without any fear. And then things started to shift. And as a Center for Human Rights, we are committed to fostering a space for robust conversations on issues and ideas which are almost always contentious. Human rights, their conflict of rights come into conflict, as we know. So we experience personally that the space is shrinking, and these pressures are coming from both within and from outside. And we are also not strangers to transnational surveillance because of the people we host. They come from places where we are being watched. So many of them do not want any web profile. I have directly been contacted by different embassies for asking me not to do certain things. And way back in 2007, a Turkish historian from Yale who was coming to speak at a conference on prevention of genocide to talk about Turkey's role in the Armenian genocide was detained at Doval airport because the Turkish embassy had called the airport to say that this is a person of security risk. And finally, we managed to get him out. So this has been a real issue for us. It's not been an issue of an abstract or a high theory issue. The second thing, and I could speak for just myself, that I lived and studied in the Soviet Union. I worked in the reform and restructuring of teaching and research in social sciences and the humanities in the post-Soviet space for a decade and a half. And that was quite instructive in understanding how institutions of higher learning can be instrumentalized for a state building project and for state to shape a society based on certain ideology. And the second experience I've had, which is a lived experience of understanding how quickly you can gain freedoms and how quickly they can shrink, is China. So McGill has had a program with China, a teaching program for 5 years, and I was involved with it. Within the span of that 5 years, so this is the beginning of Xi and then the middle period of Xi. And the first 3 years, we were very free to set what we were going to teach, how we are going to teach. And the last 2 years, we had a very strict remit, what we can and what we cannot do, the topics we could tackle, topics we cannot tackle. And for each time we taught, there was the party secretary of who is the liaison between the party and the university was in the room. And that was within a space of 5 years, where in China, particularly in faculties of law, they had certain freedoms and they shrunk. And now for Chinese to look at what is happening in the US and to say that it's like the Cultural Revolution it gives you what you say, the chill factor or an eerie sense. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And the last thing I wanted to mention was Canada itself. And we've had the history of persecution during the Cold War era, and there are numerous examples of how witch hunting happened in Canadian universities and people were sent out. But now there is something else happening, and Quebec obviously has a law now to regulate or to protect academic freedom, which in itself is, gives us a lot to think about what state has got to do with the governance and shaping of university. Although we are state-funded university, but a few days ago, Nova Scotia has tabled a bill, Bill 12, and that is even more sinister. And there is a lot of opposition to that bill, but it calls itself Advanced Education and Research. It's called Nova Scotia Act Respecting Advanced Education and Research. And it is not just an attempt to interfere with the governance of the university, it is trying to define the raison d'être of a university in Nova Scotia and its mission. And that brings me lastly to the mission itself. And I think we write in our opening chapter about the idea of pursuit of knowledge freely for the greater public good, freedom to teach and freedom to learn. The Humboldtian University principles are fairly recent. And what this book helped us understand is this is not how a mission is understood in different parts of the world. And the marketization of education in the global South is in particular problematic for the pursuit of knowledge with freedom and rigor. That is one thing. And in our context, and this is about a mission drift, which I personally feel very strongly about, that the purpose of university is now not that clear what it is. And there is a little bit of a mission drift where we sit. So these are some of the concerns we had when we put together the book, and we have brilliant people around the table who will tell us what they thought about and wrote about. So I think Jacob is the next who has to lead.
I was gonna say, among these brilliant people, the first one is Jacob Levy. Jacob has to leave us because he has another speaking engagement in a few minutes. A very busy man. So your chapter is Academic Freedom as Freedom of Complex Association. So I'll cede the floor to you.
Thank you. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Merci. Je voudrais remercier de nous accueillir ici à l'UDM. I think and write in English, and so I'm going to speak in English. My chapter is an attempt to extract what I take to be the underlying theoretical structure of academic freedom, which on the one hand is meant to be a rationalization and reflection of the evolved practice, but on the other hand is meant to give an understanding of the underlying principles, which then have some critical bite and tell us things about some contemporary disputes. And I think that while I've got the principles right and the shape of academic freedom does theoretically have the structure that I described, I also think there are elements of it that are counterintuitive and surprising. Academic freedom, as I understand it, holds that which is done within the core defined academic spaces, paradigmatically, the laboratory or research environment, classroom, and the library, must be evaluated only according to scholarly principles of inquiry. They must not be subject to rules of orthodoxy. Rules of orthodoxy means, on the one hand, externally defined political or religious orthodoxies, and these are some of the paradigmatic cases against which academic freedom took shape as a value. And on the other hand, internally defined orthodoxies as to conclusions. That is to say, in each of those settings, people must be able to articulate questions and pursue the questions according to the appropriate norms, rigors, and methods of argument and evidence, and reach the conclusions that those arguments and that evidence lead them to. That non-orthodoxy principle, no external orthodoxies of politics or religion, no internal orthodoxies of conclusions, depends at each point on the idea of there being appropriate standards of inquiry, argument, and evidence. The structure of a university is such that those appropriate standards are multiple. A university is not, in the medieval Latin sense, a college. A collegium is one group of colleagues. An universitas is an overarching umbrella association. A university is plural. A university is many, not one. A university is an association, and the university's institutional freedom, its freedom of association, is a crucial central component of academic freedom. It is where we locate the university's rightful autonomy against intrusion by the state or intrusion by the church. But a university is a funny kind of association. It's what I refer to as a complex association, a nested system of associations that themselves have self-governing autonomy. And they have self-governing autonomy in the relevant sense here to define fields by standards of argument, evidence, and inquiry. A university includes hard sciences and humanities and social sciences and often fine arts and more besides. What count as appropriate methods of scholarly inquiry are not the same across all of those. And one piece of academic freedom is that each of the units has some ability to say to the others, your norms don't apply here. We are not all of us physicists, and the physicists don't get to tell us what good arguments and what good evidence look like for us around here. We, as a self-governing unit, a college or a faculty or a disciplinary department or a multidisciplinary center, but that multidisciplinarity is itself still a confined, finite multidisciplinarity. Those units have the ability to define their space of inquiry. But within those communities, the scholarly members of the communities as individuals, whether they be tenured faculty researchers or undergraduate students or anything in between, have that same immunity from judgment on grounds of orthodoxy. The promise to all of them is their work will be evaluated according to the standards of argument and evidence that pertain locally there. If you make a good argument, if you marshal the evidence in an appropriate, honest way, according to the standards we recognize around here, your work will be evaluated based on the quality of that work, not based on the orthodoxy of your conclusions, again, whether that be the external political orthodoxy or the internal conformity with what some senior professor reached as a conclusion in their own research years ago. You will also not be subject to scholarly evaluation for things that happen outside those scholarly spaces. Here's the source of the piece of academic freedom, a counterintuitive third piece beyond freedom of research and freedom of teaching. That is freedom of extramural speech. It is a jurisdictional rule. Neither the department deciding whether to grant someone tenure, nor the professor deciding what grade to give a student, may take any notice of the content of those actors' speeches outside those spaces. The op-ed that you wrote, the tweet that you posted, the content, here I'll emphasize content, the content of the protest that you engaged in. All of those are, strictly speaking, invisible to our evaluation of you as a scholar. Again, scholar meaning anything from the professor in their employment relationship to the university to the student being evaluated in their capacity as a student by a professor. Now, that non-orthodoxy rule, I say briefly in the chapter, is not quite the same as the question that's come up a great deal in the last 18 months or so of a commitment that institutions should be neutral, strictly neutral on political or religious questions outside the core business of the academy. There's an affinity and a relationship. It is my view that a strong commitment to institutional neutrality is a very good way of making credible the promise of non-orthodoxy. But they're not, strictly speaking, the same. You could imagine a university that decides to, I will put it pejoratively, run its mouth off on lots of political questions, but that still very credibly commits to its internal members. This is just us, and we will not treat that as a standard for what it is to be a member in good scholarly standing of the institution. I'm going to say something toward the end about why it is that that balance becomes pretty hard to sustain, but it is in principle possible. That the university is a nested, complex association means that there will be different levels of those scholarly communities, but it's critically important to say that each of the acts that happens within those scholarly spaces, the classroom, the laboratory, the library, is appropriately subject to evaluation by the locally appropriate standards. Academic freedom is not bare freedom of speech. It is not the bare freedom to engage in whatever kind of speech acts one likes, wherever one likes. In liberal democratic civil society, there is a background freedom to lie. Not all lies, commercial fraud of various kinds, medical fraud of various kinds, but simply lying is not a crime in a liberal society. Lying about your research lying about who wrote your research, lying about the contents of the results of the experiments you ran, what have you, has not only no protection whatsoever, it is a grave offense against the scholarly community. And the scholarly community will, at no cost to academic freedom, penalize you to the utmost severity. Likewise, the freedom to teach is the freedom to teach the subject matter that is defined by the relevant scholarly community. The professor of astronomy may neither decide to suddenly start teaching astrology, nor suddenly decide to start teaching their political views. The academic freedom of students is one of the considerations that rules out the latter. Students would have very good reason not to believe that they weren't going to be punished for political disagreement with the professor when the professor uses the podium as a pulpit. And this comes straight out of Weber's Science as a Vocation, the statement to the professors: if you want to be talking about your politics and religion, go out into the street and say it where other people are free to speak back. Do not do it from the podium to the students who then feel they have to agree with you. But neither is the professor free to just start doing other stuff, even if it's not political or religious stuff. There is a sense in which there is a job to do, and the students there have a right to learn the curriculum that has been locally defined by the department, the college, the faculty, whatever the relevant unit is. And those levels of self-government with the university, a department, a faculty, and so on, can all set standards for what it's like to teach and for what each of those nested units of teaching is like. These can indeed be quite demanding and restrictive. A disciplinary department may have a very strict sequence of courses. And if you're going to do your job, you have to fulfill in your class the content that the person teaching the next class in the sequence expects the students to have learned. Or you need to be preparing your students for the bar, or you need to be, in one way or another, you need to be doing the thing that we as a collegium, as a department, as a faculty, have decided the courses are for. That sets boundaries within which you're free to adopt different pedagogical styles. You're free to choose which particular readings. Freedom to teach matters, but freedom to teach faces constraints from both the need for students to feel protected against the imposition of orthodoxy and the associational freedom of the academic unit to set a curriculum. Academic freedom is not in the first instance an individual right. It has various echoes and rhymes with liberal civil liberties, but it is a pre-liberal institution. And it is an associational corporate institution in the first instance that says to the individual members of the community that they may be judged always but only according to the scholarly standards of that unit. Now, I promised there would be some implications of this that aren't just rationalization. Among the implications that I think could be near to the front of the mind over the last couple of years are ones about who is within the scope of academic freedom and what the shape of the protections of extramural political speech mean and amount to. Who's within the scope? Two surprises, I think, relative to things that a lot of people think. One is someone who is not a member of the university community is not a beneficiary or rights holder of academic freedom. An off-campus person who is invited on campus to speak is not a bearer of academic freedom. There is a bearer of academic freedom in the picture. It's the host unit. But the outside speaker does not as such have academic freedom. The political disputes over whether universities are sufficiently welcoming to conservative voices has sometimes very deliberately elided these distinctions and made it seem as if the Milo Yiannopoulos or Ben Shapiro's of the world are the people who have a right to speak. There's no right of an outsider to speak on a college campus. There is a right, if a scholarly unit or a student association for that matter has invited a guest, that there's a right on the part of those members of the community that the event not be disrupted or shut down on the grounds of its content. But it is a right among members of the community. If people decide to try to shut an event down, that should be understood not as an offense against the outsider, but as an extremely anti-collegial act among fellow members. Second surprise, students are fully within the scope of academic freedom, understood as a protection against orthodoxy with the concomitant protection of extramural speech. This is not the position of some of the professional associations that have tried to define academic freedom, and I think that they're genuinely wrong. I think they've come to misunderstand important things about practice. But third, and this will be my final thing, that there's an emphasis on non-orthodoxy, and the freedom of extramural speech arises out of its kind of invisibility to and irrelevance to the scholarly mission. Does mean that some of what is claimed under rubrics of freedom to protest are not genuine university values. The university must be able to protect its core academic spaces, the classroom, the laboratory and research space, the library. It must be able to protect them against disruption. That means that it must have what in US constitutional law is referred to as time, place, and manner restrictions on what kinds of protest can happen, where, and when. Remember, it must not have content-based restrictions. That's orthodoxy. But it must be able to credibly commit to pretty robust time, place, and manner restrictions. Said a few minutes ago, I was going to come back to a reason why I think neutrality is a valuable piece of university credibility. Because the university is going to be called upon sometimes to really enforce the time, place, and manner restrictions. When it's doing so, there's a very strong interest shared by the whole community and indeed by the larger society in whose politics the university is enmeshed, that it be really credible when the university says, we are not punishing the content of your speech. The more need there might be to have to call security or call the police to do things like secure your classroom spaces and secure your libraries, the more critical it is that everyone really believe the university not have an orthodox view on the subject matter at hand. And if you've abandoned neutrality and let the university run its mouth off too much at time one, the credibility of non-orthodoxy at time two, when you have to call security to clear out the protesters, is absolutely reasonably compromised. Trust has been sacrificed. The more we come to understand that ongoing protest will genuinely and appropriately and legitimately be part of university life, I think the stronger the need for the universities to be extremely careful and err on the side of caution about veering out beyond core university business into the wider politics of the world in ways that could downstream undermine their credibility as to maintaining political non-orthodoxy in such moments.
Thank you very much. And I recognize the irony of my position, which is to tell professors to stop talking about academic freedom. But unfortunately, I am the keeper of the time. And so from chapter 2, we move on to chapter 11, which is the simultaneous crucial pursuit of academic. Yes.
Désolé pour déranger. If there are direct questions right now, because he will.
No, you have to
Yes.
leave. So
So
if there are any questions.
This is the moment, because then he'll step out and then we can continue.
Thank you.
Merci.
Merci. So, s'il y a des questions dans la salle ou des questions en ligne, any questions online or in the audience?
Okay. So I want to read the chapter now. I'm just wondering about this definition of, you say, the unit, the department, the faculty, and the idea that there at some core, there has to be some common view of, evidence, arguments, and can't that in itself, like, where does it stop, the ability to debate? How do you get to that point where it's not orthodoxy?
Here, I'm reluctant to say that there's a formula
about it.
Darn.
Because I think that it looks very different across hard sciences, the interpretive humanities. There are moments of apparent politicization that I think we can point to, and that even outsiders can point to and say something troubling seems to be going on here.
Mhm.
But the question of the difference between, say, the subject of inquiry and orthodoxy of conclusions, that's something that I think genuinely does have to be worked out internally, and only under pretty rare circumstances can complete outsiders pass judgment. Now, there are, in a complex nested association, there might be levels beyond complete outsiders.
Mhm.
So you might have a college of the humanities or a faculty of arts that is able to intervene and say, you in this department of social science, it seems to us as if you are allowing some orthodoxy about conclusions to creep into your substantive evaluations. And in the moments when a department comes up for external review, which is a standard practice, that is an appropriate question to ask by external reviewers, external to the university, and by the internal review system. If you're a unit that isn't nested within another unit smaller than the university as a whole, if you're a freestanding faculty of law that doesn't have departments within it, then it's going to be hard to know who the right actors are. But I think that's just genuinely hard. Now, the question, where does it stop if you keep going downward, is going to have to involve some ability of the individual scholarly members to demand appropriate certainty and clarity in advance, and to be able to make, after the fact, appeals. Standards of clarity in advance, one of the standard ways that we do this is by saying each department or unit recognizes a range of publishers and journals as vettors of research. There are genuine costs to that way of doing things, but it does mean that the individual scholar within a unit that might not be welcoming of their work can keep saying, look, my work keeps passing peer review by people we recognize as part of this scholarly community. So the scholarly community is not confined within one university. The scholarly community crosses all institutions. And it becomes a valuable piece of evidence they have to say, you can't deny me tenure. Look, I have published in all of the venues that we recognize as the top venues in what we define to be our scholarly community. If you try to deny me tenure after that, we have good grounds to suspect that you are disagreeing with my conclusions, not with my ability to be a good scholar within the area. Is that in the neighborhood of, okay.
Sophie had a question as well.
Yeah, I just have a short question about this distinction that you make between the outside and the inside, in the sense that you said you think that professors, or actually any member of the academic community, should not be judged while on the inside for whatever they do on the outside, if I understand you correctly.
For the content of their
For the
speech.
content of their speech, I mean, you mean for the content of their speech that happens inside or outside?
Outside.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, they should not, yeah, exactly. They should not be judged by the inside for any of the content of their speech on the outside.
Can't deny you tenure, can't give you a bad grade
Right. Yeah,
because
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't like your blog post.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
I just feel like this distinction between outside and inside is so blurred nowadays, in the sense of we give value to the positive things that happen on the outside, but then we don't want to give negative, you know what I mean? Like if, for example, someone on the outside has been extremely, let's say like a professor of social work has been a volunteer for years in like Table-ronde and has like firsthand experience of anyway, like things that are happening with the population, like la population sans abri. And so we give value to something that happens on the outside, and we'll use that to sort of grant them tenure, grant them more credits on the inside. But then if that thing is suddenly negative, then it can't discredit them. Is that, for me, like you see that there's just a porosity between the outside and the inside that it makes it hard to completely not acknowledge what happens on the outside or the credibility issue of the inside. Okay.
Yeah, I'll say something about your examples and then about one very hard case that beyond that there are asymmetries between, say, offers and threats, that I'm allowed to give you extra, but I'm not allowed to take away. That asymmetry is a sufficiently common, widespread, normatively acceptable practice that I think we can allow some space to say, you can earn extra credit, but you cannot be penalized. But I get really nervous about the extra credit really quickly. I do not think a professor may legitimately say, you will get extra credit for going and attending this protest rally for a cause that I support. And there are people who try to do this. And I think it is a clear offense against the non-orthodoxy piece. To the degree that the extra starts to look conditional on agreement with an orthodoxy, then it's an attack on the core of academic freedom. And if that means, nope, we have to go back to giving tenure only on the grounds of your research and not on the grounds of your nice extra stuff, then that's a bullet I'm not particularly going to mind biting. I think this is also true, by the way, for media work. It's a nice thing, and it's a nice thing when universities recognize the nice things that you do. McGill has a prize for media engagement.
I just said that.
But we have a prize for media engagement cannot mean that the university then gains the right to revoke someone's tenure because they did media bad. And if that's the implication, then we need to abolish the media prize, not we need to then authorize the tenure revocations. So the hardest case, I think, are cases of extramural speech that happen under a kind of cover of scholarly relevance. I'm a professor of biology. And what I mean by professor of biology is I study plants, but I go out and present myself into the world as an expert on why you shouldn't have vaccines. Because I'm a professor of biology. That's extramural speech that's happening under a kind of false cover of scholarly credibility. And that example is not accidental. There have been really live cases about that. And I find these cases extremely difficult how to think about what a legitimate university response is to them. That's a moment when the inside-outside stuff is being deliberately blurred by the actor to take advantage of internal status for external voice. It's an abuse. What we do in response to that abuse is, I think, pretty hard. But we will pay steep prices if we are very quick on the trigger to say, well, as soon as you called yourself a professor at the bottom of your op-ed, that meant you were acting under scholarly cover, and that means that we can punish you because we don't like your political views. And I'm very worried about the downside risk on that side of allowing in exceptions to the extramural speech protection on the other. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob, for joining us, and we'll let you go now so you can get to your next presentation, making all of us look bad for only having one conference per day. And so thank you again. And as I was mentioning before, from chapter 2 or chapter 11, the simultaneous crucial pursuit of equity, diversity, and inclusion through a relational approach. And Angela, the floor is yours.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Alors, bonjour tout le monde. C'est un vrai plaisir d'être parmi vous cet après-midi. Moi aussi, je vais faire mes commentaires en anglais, the language, which I'm most comfortable in the language of the paper. So over the years since this paper was drafted, a lot has happened. Jacob has alluded to some of it. I'll just give a little bit of a background around the paper and then talk a little bit about where we are now, and just would say that I'm going to speak very frankly, even though I'm in an administrative position that often causes me to be very careful speaking about academic freedom in environments like this one and on topics like this one. So In the paper, when I wrote this paper, when the idea for it was first conceived, it was in the like late 2020s. So it was kind of at a moment of a peak in the Black Lives Matter movement. And it also came on the heels of Me Too, several years, or maybe a couple years prior. And in my role at the university at the time, I was overseeing equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives, and I'm also professor of law, taught criminal justice several times. So I built the article around a case study that aimed to show how these two values and these two things to which universities are committed, equity and inclusion on the one hand and academic freedom on the other, could sometimes be in tension with one another. And I used a case study that was fictional, but linked to a variety of things I'd seen over time. And it went along the following lines. So there was a professor of criminal justice who took the position that the rape shield legislation in the criminal code was a deprivation of the rights to the accused to make a full answer in defense. So protected or did not sufficiently protect the accused's constitutional liberties, and felt that it was appropriate for the Crown, for prosecutors to be able to bring in evidence about the rape history or the sexual history, and to be deprived of rape shield laws of the complainant in a case. And the professor argued that in order to protect the rights of the accused, which were the most sacred thing in a democracy, in a free and democratic society, there had to be the ability to make full answer in defense. And this included the ability to raise questions about conduct, including sexual conduct on the part of the complainant. And in the case study, some students in the class indicated that they began an email campaign and they asked for the professor to be removed or to have a substitute be brought in the sessions during the module on sexual violence. And if the chair of the department would not remove the instructor for those sessions, that they would wear black to class as a kind of indication of protest of the professor and her views. And they also emailed the classmates to say, if you're going to be in class and the chair is not going to get involved and deal with this, then I invite you all to wear black with us to show your solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. And in the narrative, the students went first to the professor, and the professor said, "I've heard this before. You're not novel. You're not unique. Thank you for your opinion. I won't be changing a thing." The chair gave a very terse response and said, the professor is free to do what she wants, and your duty is to learn. And the students kind of carried on with their intervention, we'll say. And so this kind of scenario kind of presented and at the end of the day, as is very common in the work that I do, everybody walks away upset, anguished, dissatisfied, and hurt. And so it caused me to think through what would be an appropriate way to start supporting people who were involved in these really difficult situations where it's possible to make credible claims and arguments on all sides. And I've seen, and obviously I've been a law student, I've been a law professor, and now seeing things from an institutional perspective, it's a really interesting thing to kind of hear the variety of perspectives and to see the same situation through a prism, through multiple lenses. And on the institutional side, to often feel like, I'm sort of having my like pen like tug, like step in, get involved. And then sometimes when you do step in, it's like, this is not your business. This is a space that's supposed to be free of you as an administrative actor. Step back and mind your lane. And so kind of trying to tread that line super carefully. So to think through what would be an appropriate frame to bring to conversations like this, where the institutional presence could be felt not as an intrusive or savior way. So not a persecutor, not a savior, but what is the appropriate role for an institutional presence in conflicts like this? And I wanted to think through also a way in which to move away from a rights conversation to start thinking about relationships and responsibilities. So, because all of these conversations and I get so many emails, and the number of emails just continue, and the escalation in tenor and tone has just ratcheted up, and it was ratcheting up when this paper was written, but since October 7th, 2023, it has become a whole different ballgame. And the tone is so strong and strident And everything is framed as a series of demands. And if you do not do X, you will be demonstrating yourself as complicit, apathetic, and kind of part of a major problem that's causing the deterioration of the dignity of the population concerned. And so trying to think through if everyone were to engage from a place of thinking about the relationships that deserve preservation and the responsibility to foreground relationships, what could this scenario and the analysis of it look like? So in the scenario with the case study, thinking about what the students have to bring to the conversation, and they're thinking about the difference between formal and informal power. So in that case study, there was, a strong perception on the part of the students that they were victims in the situation, and that the oppressor was the instructor who was bringing her views roughshod to bear on a classroom that was, as Jacob will call it, her pulpit. So really kind of ramming her views down the students' throats without any chance for students who were themselves survivors or allies of them to be able to feel safe in the learning environment. And at the same time, so not seeing how the email campaign that was sent around and the wearing black to class would impact the professor and her views. And in the situation, I forgot one element I forgot, is that the professor in this scenario was herself a survivor of sexual violence. And she stepped in and asked her chair to make the students cease and desist with their email campaign. So they were both bringing complaints to the chair, and the chair was like, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for a 3-year term because it was my turn and I got put in the role, and get me out of here pronto. So then the chair is also asking for support from the administration to be able to navigate this impossible situation. So the students really not seeing the power that they could wield and exercise on the well-being of the professor, and also on the whole dynamic of the classroom, and of fellow students who felt like, hey, I'm really left with no choice. I either have to miss class, wear black, or be viewed as somebody who's lining up with the professor, because it's a binary. You're wearing black or you're not. And the professor really being very kind of adamant, like, these are my rights. I'm teaching the way I want. Thank you for expressing your views. We're carrying on as I planned. And then the chair, who was just very, very banal and unnuanced in the engagement, which said, it's a simple case of academic freedom. So my hands are tied. And that, to me, was a lazy response. Your hands might be tied from a framework of like disciplining the professor, but that is by far not what the students are asking you for. They're asking you for something to demonstrate your care and concern for the learning space in which they're participating. So that was the kind of frame. And in the context of thinking about the institution, one of the things that I thought about was, what are the roles and the responsibilities of an institution? And I framed them in 3 different ways. And so one was thinking about where and how the institution allocates resources. And that might seem like a kind of budget question, but the reality is that when these situations pop up, resources really do matter. So where and how the university puts its support services, where it puts its attention and energy, it makes a big difference. So we've had lots of cases where speakers are invited to campus, and some student groups and sometimes even faculty will chime in and say, cancel this. It's really hurtful to our and it's damaging to our well-being to have this talk carry on. We won't cancel it in most cases, and unless there's a security risk, and I can go into a little bit more about that in a moment. But we will say, what can we do? What's your next best alternative if this event's going on? And often it's about an event that they want to plan for themselves. So there's ways to kind of imagine this, and we've done a lot of work in this regard with different student groups. It's never perfect, though, I will say. It's very, very hard to reach perfect satisfaction, if not impossible. The other thing is the communications, and this goes to the question of when and how a university is public and speaks publicly. So what's the university's position on various topics? And there's various ways an institution can speak. And I want to come back to this because both Fred and Jacob touched on this, but the institution, like the universities have, in Jacob's framing, run their mouths off a lot on a variety of topics without thinking in the long run. And And that is true of, I would say, pretty much the moment of the late 2010s, early 2020s. And now there's this kind of effort to cycle back really fast and say neutrality, we're looking for neutrality. And Fred, you asked, at Columbia, what the hell's happening? When is the message coming? Well, there's not going to probably be a message. People are immobilized into silence. And from my perspective, and this is me speaking personally, not as a university administrator, a silence is a message. When you do not speak, you're communicating at the same time. So the demands to speak, to not speak are fast, furious, and frequent. They are nonstop, all the time. And so the framing is the institution's positionality, neutrality, voice. That is a really fraught topic that is not going to be resolved anytime soon, because there's deep confusion about institutional neutrality. So there's a perception that if the institution is neutral, and lots of universities have issued nice statements about being neutral, going back to Chicago principles from some years ago, predating all of this time of anguish. And the confusion, especially in the community, including the student community to some extent, and even in the faculty community, is that means that anyone who holds a position of authority and influence should themselves be neutral. So if you're a professor in a classroom, you should be neutral. And that's completely at odds with the principles of academic freedom. Institutional neutrality, at least in my view, means that the institution is communicating in a multitude of ways through a multiple series of entry points, that it will not penalize any member of its academic community for the content of the position that it holds and the arguments that it makes. And that, because otherwise institutions will be muted and their hands will be tied, they will not be able to speak. So reimagine the summer of 2020, the murder of George Floyd. Would universities say we can't speak because we're neutral on the issues of anti-Black racism, right? That would not, I hope, happen. All universities spoke that summer, very unequivocally. So how do we then imagine a space of being neutral, but allowing for a multiplicity of voices to be able to rise up and feel safe in so doing, without the prospect of retort or of a penalty. I just want to talk a little bit about an article that a student, an amazing doctoral student in the law faculty who's working with me, we're presently leading an advisory panel on campus expression at McGill. And there's a fantastic doctoral student who sent me this article by two professors at Harvard, Jacob Gerson and Jeannie Sue Gerson. And their article is called Academic Freedom and Discipline, the Case of the Arguably Peaceful Protesters. And I really recommend this. It's an easy read. It also takes a case study approach, and it builds on the modality of the Fuller article about the case of the Spelunkian explorers from the late 40s after World War II, and kind of takes a case study and then turns it around, and then has kind of like the bench with the majority decision, and then the positions of the kind of concurring and dissenting voices on the bench. So I just want to read you a couple of passages from different perspectives. And I'm sharing this because I felt very seen reading this piece, because it was just very resonant with the experiences. So one of the jurists on the panel says, because all calls for statements come from members of our community, the failure to issue a statement supporting one group on campus inevitably feels like a slight or denigration, because our administration has issued statements supporting other groups on campus in the past. Thus, the incentive to issue ever more statements of condemnation or support is at cross purposes with maintaining a welcoming community for all. It goes on to say, but a university with students and faculty members with wildly divergent views should not be in the business of offering public statements on hotly contested political conflicts. It does no service to the world, to our mission, or to our students. And then another says the following, and this is very short. A vote against discipline, because the whole question is whether or not these students involved in a protest that has a multitude of different activities, some of which involve violence and vandalism, others of which are peaceful. Another one says a vote against discipline will similarly be understood as a stand against Israel in favor of Palestinians in Gaza. I have no idea which views of which of our students are correct. But I do know one thing, no matter what we say in our opinions, whatever careful reasoning we use, the world will always understand us to be picking sides. So I'll leave it at that and just say that just from a really practical perspective, the challenge of trying to make sure that the institutional perspective, voice, and position of or sense of neutrality is a tricky one to accomplish even through sitting on one's hands and staying silent. And that the risk is never higher than I would feel at this moment, at least in our generation, if not our lifetime, to make sure that institutions get this right, because it's a super precarious moment, I would say, for faculty and students.
And I know I have a bunch of questions. I also know that the authors of that article probably owe you a couple of dollars, because I have a feeling their ranking on SSRN is gonna go through your roof, because I'm seeing people taking pictures and noting it down. But we'll keep the questions for the end and move to the other side of the table. So from chapter 11, we go to chapter 9, freedom for all, academic freedom in a pluralistic society. Je vous cède le micro.
Alors, bonjour, je vous remercie de m'accueillir. Alors, je vais vous faire part de certains de mes commentaires. Je pense que cette histoire-là, pour moi, a commencé, cet article-là a mûri d'une certaine façon inconsciente. À partir de 2010, au moment où je faisais ma maîtrise à l'université McGill, mon professeur de Theoretical Approach a parlé de Kant. Alors, moi, étant une étudiante noire dans son cours, ayant un téléphone cellulaire, j'ai googlé Kant avec race. Et là, je me suis rendu compte que Kant avait qualifié les gens en tenant compte de la race. Alors, pour moi, je n'ai pas fait de manifestation directe au professeur, mais j'ai décidé de direct, c'est-à-dire dans la classe, alors que tous les étudiants étaient là, mais j'ai décidé d'aller lui parler après pour lui dire, écoutez, j'ai pas de problème à ce que vous parliez de Kant, de Hume. Et ensuite, vous les connaissez, là, je veux dire aussi Hegel aussi qui a écrit sur la race. Je n'ai aucun problème à ce que vous en parlez. La seule chose que je vous demanderais, c'est de me mentionner que ces gens-là ont participé à la classification de certains individus, comme moi, à l'extérieur de ce qu'on appelle l'humanité ou de la connaissance. Alors, c'est un peu là qu'a commencé ma démarche en ce qui a trait à cet article. Un autre trigger, si on veut, c'est ce qui s'est passé aussi à l'Université d'Ottawa relativement à la professeure lieutenant Duval et tout ce qui est arrivé qui a créé, dans le fond, qui a créé un momentum pour la loi sur la loi québécoise. Alors, ces deux éléments-là, pour moi, étant l'utilisation du mot en haine, etc., ce sont des éléments qui m'ont frappé personnellement, étant situé un peu à l'extérieur du cercle primaire, mais plutôt dans le cercle secondaire de la connaissance. Alors, j'ai réfléchi un peu sur ces questions-là, puis je me suis un peu penchée sur la question du contrat social qui a été défini par Maes. Et Maes m'a apporté un peu de confort dans le sens où il a confirmé qu'effectivement, j'étais à l'extérieur du centre et qu'il a dit que le contrat social n'était pas un contrat, était plutôt un contrat racial considérant ses effets. Et cette réflexion-là a continué à évoluer. Après ça, je me suis posé des questions, puis c'est encore en lien avec la conversation que j'avais eue avec mon professeur en Theoretical Approach. Où est-ce que je me situe, moi, par rapport à tout ça, dans une université où le contrat racial a toujours des effets? Alors, puis des effets qu'on peut qualifier, puis ma collègue parlera tout à l'heure de l'injustice épistémique. L'injustice épistémique faisant partie de ces effets-là. Non seulement la discrimination qui peut exister dans les lieux, mais également l'injustice épistémique qui peut être soit testimoniale ou herméneutique, comme vous en avez parlé dans votre article. Alors, ça, ce sont des éléments qui m'ont amené à réfléchir un peu sur cette question de liberté académique. Ma collègue, tout à l'heure, faisait mention de ce qui peut être pensé à l'Université de Chicago. Effectivement, au moment où ces normes-là étaient établies, les personnes racisées, même les femmes, les personnes avec certaines religions n'avaient pas nécessairement accès à l'université, ils ne pouvaient pas rentrer dans cette université-là. Alors, J'ai regardé un peu l'évolution de ces questions-là. Donc, la recommandation de l'UNESCO dont vous faites mention, dans laquelle on considère que la liberté académique, ben, c'est-à-dire que la Cour suprême nous a appris qu'on peut utiliser les instruments internationaux pour interpréter. Puis la recommandation concernant la condition du personnel enseignant de l'enseignement supérieur de l'UNESCO, 1997, prévoit que les établissements devraient défendre la liberté académique ainsi que les droits fondamentaux. Les étudiants doivent être traités de façon équitable, juste, sans aucune discrimination. Puis après ça, j'ai regardé la Commission interaméricaine des droits de l'homme, les principes interaméricains sur la liberté académique et l'autonomie universitaire. Et parmi ces principes, on mentionne mettre de l'avant l'importance de la non-discrimination dans l'interprétation de la liberté académique et considérer le bien commun comme la justification ultime à la liberté académique, soit permettre la consolidation de la démocratie, le pluralisme des idées, le progrès scientifique et le développement humain et sociétal. Ces principes soulignent également que quand il y a un conflit de droit, le mécanisme de la proportionnalité devra s'appliquer. Alors, venons-en à la loi québécoise. Alors, celle-ci, c'était la réponse à, on en reviendra tout à l'heure un peu plus sur le détail, mais c'était la réponse à l'intervention qui était d'ailleurs sur Zoom. À ce moment-là, la professeure Matt Duval donnait son cours sur Zoom. Il donne aussi, puis là-dessus, je n'ai pas développé, mais ça amène aussi d'autres questions, à savoir qui était dans la classe, qui n'était pas dans la classe, puis qu'est-ce qui se passait réellement. Et cette intervention-là, dans laquelle elle a prononcé le mot que j'appellerais le mot en haine, et les médias se sont emparés de ça, puisque c'était enregistré, les médias se sont emparés, on a créé une panique morale, puis après ça, le gouvernement s'est emparé de cette histoire-là. Et qu'est-ce que l'accouchement, finalement, ça a été la loi sur la liberté académique. L'un des considérants de cette loi-là, c'est la loi réfère, à la recommandation, donc je faisais la recommandation de l'UNESCO, et reconnaît le plein exercice des libertés académiques, que le plein exercice des libertés académiques suppose l'autonomie des établissements. Or, la loi omet de mentionner que les dispositions de la recommandation elle omet de mentionner les dispositions de la recommandation qui visent la discrimination. Alors que le Canada fait partie des États interaméricains, nulle mention n'est faite des principes interaméricains mentionnés précédemment. La loi, donc, ignore le contexte social, soit que les universités sont de plus en plus diversifiées, comme le mentionnait la professeure Campbell. Un des effets de la loi, c'est de faire primer la liberté académique, les droits fondamentaux, notamment en ce qui a trait à la discrimination. De plus, la loi interdit les avertissements, les trigger warnings, ce qui est un peu problématique quand on a une population diversifiée dans laquelle, si on reprend l'argument de ma collègue, où on veut établir une relation avec, c'est-à-dire que l'université est un lieu de relation et non seulement un lieu d'éducation et dans lequel on veut avoir des discussions pour pouvoir arriver à partager la connaissance ou en tout cas à faire émerger d'autres connaissances également. Alors, l'étude du cas, moi, que j'ai regardé, c'est le mot en haine. Alors, le mot en haine est issu d'un système justifiant les hiérarchies raciales, les privilèges. C'est une insulte. Puis, je pense que je vais prendre un exemple personnel là-dessus. J'en ai parlé la semaine dernière. J'ai rarement été interpellée par ce mot-là. La seule fois où je l'ai été, ça a été dans un métro il y a à peu près 25 ans. J'étais assise, une femme m'a interpellée, une femme d'un certain âge m'a interpellée, probablement à l'âge que j'ai aujourd'hui. Elle m'a dit, elle a employé le mot en haine, puis elle m'a dit, lève-toi, donne-moi ta place. Puis c'était on était dans un milieu calme, et tout d'un coup, l'effet que ça a fait chez moi, je m'en rappelle encore, il y a une boule de chaleur qui est montée dans ma gorge. Et la seule satisfaction que j'aurais eue, ça aurait été de prendre sa tête et de la frapper sur le mur jusqu'à temps que ça saigne. Or, je n'ai rien fait de cela puisque je suis ici avec vous. Mais tout ça pour dire que ce n'est pas une agression banale. Ça suscite des émotions qui sont très fortes. Et moi, j'ai été élevée à Cette-Île sur la Côte-Nord. J'ai eu des petites taquineries des Autochtones. J'ai écrit un article là-dessus, mais c'est hors sujet. Mais jamais on m'a pointé, agressé, refusé un droit parce que, de façon aussi directe, j'avais jamais vécu ça. Alors, quand on parle du mot en haine, que les gens essaient de dire oui, mais c'est pas grave, c'est pas ci, c'est pas ça, moi, j'ai beaucoup de réserves par rapport à ça. Et j'étais pas une enfant, j'avais plus que 25 ans, j'avais peut-être 30 ans à ce moment-là. Je ne peux pas m'imaginer l'effet que ça peut avoir sur des enfants ou encore sur même des gens à l'université. Parce que cette semaine aussi, je parlais de ça. Pourquoi, je ne sais pas. On sait très bien que les étudiants qui arrivent à 19 ans, ou peut-être à l'université McGill, c'est moins le cas, mais leurs cerveaux ne sont pas complètement développés et leurs réactions ne sont pas nécessairement régulières. Donc, arriver avec cette agression-là sans qu'on s'y attende, ça crée un tumulte à l'intérieur. Je pense qu'il est important de comprendre ça parce qu'il y a eu beaucoup de paroles qui ont été prononcées disant ben, c'est pas si grave, on a le droit de le prononcer, puis là, après ça, on va aller dans la Vallière. L'eau se fait rare ici.
Continuez, je vous sers.
Merci. Merci. Alors, puis en plus, ici, le mot en haine a un sens qui est aussi politisé, parce que bon, quand on a pris le livre Haine d'Amérique, on a politisé ce mot-là. On en a fait autre chose, mais il faut vraiment revenir à la base. Qu'est-ce que Vallière? Vallière, qu'est-ce que quand tu dis le mot, quand tu appelles son livre Les haines blancs d'Amérique, il crée une interprétation, il fait une hyperbole. Mais cette hyperbole-là ne tient pas compte de l'expérience québécoise, à savoir qu'il y avait effectivement une élite québécoise francophone, et en même temps que c'est ahistorique par rapport aux personnes noires du Québec, parce qu'il y avait du racisme systémique, il y avait des personnes noires au Québec depuis les années 1600. Donc, de prendre ce titre-là et d'en faire un blanc d'Amérique, c'est de nier cette expérience du racisme. Puis je veux dire, quand on regarde, bon, il y a eu Angélique, il y a eu aussi le fait qu'on a un cimetière qui s'appelait Nigger Rock. Il y a aussi, mais si on regarde au niveau juridique, il y a les actes de capitulation de Montréal qui traitent à l'article 47 de façon spécifique sur qu'en est-il de la disposition des personnes qui étaient des esclaves à ce moment-là. Nous savons que les esclaves étaient tant autochtones que noirs, mais qu'en est-il? L'article 47 dispose, en 1760, je dis que les esclaves continueront à appartenir à leur maître. Donc, on comprend que ce n'est pas externe à la population, externe à l'histoire du Québec, c'est-à-dire. Vallière assimile le travailleur au N. On peut dire que l'expérience des Québécois est similaire, à des similitudes avec l'expérience des Noirs, mais c'est une expérience de classe dont on parle ici. Alors que quand on regarde les Canadiens français, les Québécois, selon l'époque où on se situe, n'ont jamais été des biens meubles dont on pouvait disposer. Donc, on ne peut pas, la façon dont Vallière parle du mot en haine, il enlève le concept, le déracialise d'une certaine façon. Il reste 2 minutes. OK, je me sens blanc. On va y aller à la conclusion. Alors, bon, pour ce qui est de la professeure, bon, j'ai parlé de la panique morale. Puis je pense que c'est important d'être conscient que cette panique-là donne une ouverture à des décisions qui ne sont pas nécessairement totalement rationnelles. Puis cette panique morale peut être assimilable à de la panique raciale. Puis ça, c'est un concept que mon collègue a développé dans un de ses livres, un article que le professeur MEGRET a développé dans un de ses articles en droit international. Alors, pour moi, la liberté académique, on a un devoir, c'est-à-dire la conclusion, c'est-à-dire aucun devoir intellectuel n'impose l'obligation d'utiliser des mots déshumanisants. Au contraire, l'obligation des universités est de tenir compte des droits fondamentaux et agir avec doigté, sensibilité. La liberté académique ne peut servir pour faire taire ou marginaliser davantage les voix d'étudiants et des professeurs marginalisés. Le contrat racial relève les angles morts du contrat social lorsque l'université envisage l'émancipation à partir d'une perspective biaisée de la liberté académique. Seuls les membres de la majorité en bénéficient. Il faut appréhender la liberté académique en tenant compte du contrat racial. Et puisque les universités ont été proactives dans la construction sociale et politique du construit social qu'est la race, le temps n'est-il pas venu véritablement de réparer l'exclusion historique vécue par les personnes noires afin de permettre que l'expérience académique soit exposée, soit vécue sans traumatisme? Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Et je me permets, je suis curieux, donc la réaction de votre professeur quand vous lui avez demandé d'être plus explicite par rapport à Kant? Est-ce que vous osez nous le partager?
Oui, parfaitement. Il m'a dit que depuis lors, il a changé son approche, puis il me remercie. Puis d'ailleurs, il en a discuté dans d'autres forums. Alors pour lui, souvent on agit avec des angles morts. Donc pour lui, je vais parler de son angle mort et pour lui, ça a changé sa façon d'enseigner. Je pourrais même dire son nom, mais je n'ai pas parlé avant.
On est juste heureux, donc, qu'il y avait une ouverture. Écoutez, du chapitre 9, on passe au chapitre 10 et la dernière, mais certainement pas la moindre, Sophie BISPING va nous parler de Academic Freedom and Social Justice in Quebec.
Oui, je me fais bref parce que je sais que l'événement termine à 16h et il est 15h.
Oui,
donc,
ça va, on a jusqu'à 16h30. Vous avez 15 minutes.
Mais well, and I'll switch to English because I wrote this in English and so it's easier for me to talk about it in English. But as I was reading as I was rereading my chapter these last few days to sort of like prepare for this event, it struck me how it felt like it aged quickly. Like I wrote this two years ago about kind of similar kind of the public debate in Quebec, also after the incidents at University of Ottawa with Verouche Duval. And it feels like right now the public debate that took place after this event feels like it has been kind of pushed aside because the concerns that we have now are so much more vivid and it felt like back then social change was sort of moving at a more manageable pace. But now I still stand by what I wrote, and so I'll still walk you through it. But I would be curious to know how I would have written this differently in the context of now, where just last week I was reading about the Minister of Higher Education, Pascal Derry, who called three professors who do you say again, ingérence, who meddled with the content of like 3 different classes at Cégep Vanier, Cégep Dawson, Cégep John Abbott, in classes that had some content about Palestine. And so just last week I was reading this and I thought, wow, and it kind of passed quickly in the press. And so it just feels like a different moment. But what I wrote about 2 years ago was kind of I wanted to try and reconcile what I saw as a false dichotomy between social justice and academic freedom. It seems to me that after the events at University of Ottawa, that there were sort of 2 big sides of the debate in Quebec. And of course, there was many other perspectives, but I sort of outlined 2 big sides, one of which being professors and students as well, actually, who claimed that there was too much self-censorship, that there was like a fear of self-censorship in oh yeah, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the events, right? Okay, I can tell you very quickly. Very quickly. So in 2020, as Tamara mentioned, a professor of University of Ottawa, in the context of a class, I think, on gender and literature, used the N-word in a quote, and then she faced reprisal from the students and also from the administration and of the University of Ottawa, and leading to sort of a big debate on student demands, professors' freedom to use words even when quoted, etc.
I just wanted to say, for the sake of clarity, she used this word to explain how a pejorative, an insult, can be repurposed by the community to take the power away from it being an insult. So I think the context was not nothing.
Yeah, and it was in a quote.
It was, and no, and she tried, and the second element, and she was a young contract lecturer, had no tenure protection. So she was not, the power balance between her and the students was different. And it was a Zoom class as well. So there are many elements to this and how it got out of control.
Yeah. And but it was sort of a spark that led to a wider debate. And yeah, as I was saying, it seems to me that in this debate, there was, one side that sort of said, oh, professors and students have to self-censor and this is wrong. We should deal with that. And the other side saying this is exaggerated. Students' claims are valid, and it's kind of scandalizing like valid demands. And it seemed to me that there was sort of, this false dichotomy that was created between social justice and academic freedom. And I wanted to try to sort of rework a definition of academic freedom that could be understood as a bit broader and as running parallel to the aims of social justice. And I did that by kind of thinking about both the content and the methods of student demands in this context. So first, thinking about the content of the student demands, I wanted to contextualize these demands to change curriculums and to deplatform speakers by sort of looking at a decolonial protests. Several students' associations in their statements to the public mentioned that this was part of like a decolonial movement. And in doing so, I think they wanted to sort of resituate the university as an institution that had both contributed to colonialism and profited from it greatly. And that the legacy of that profit was still felt today in different ways, in ways that, for example, that we can look at under the broad concept of epistemic justice. And one side of that epistemic justice is who we give credibility to, who we see as being a valid speaker for a topic, and who we don't give credibility to. And so it seemed to me that these demands wanted to re-equilibrate or sort of like think more deeply about epistemic justice in the context of learning, and kind of have more agency in what we receive as knowledge of who has credibility and who doesn't have credibility. So that was kind of a discussion about the content of these demands. And then I also wanted to see how this could be integrated to a definition of academic freedom. So kind of similar in some ways to what Jacob Levy was saying earlier, I see academic freedom as a collective right vested in a community, and one that also comes with obligations, such as the ones you mentioned in the case of the American Court for Human Rights, whereby academic freedom is often defined as also having an obligation of social responsibility. And I think it's worthwhile to think of if the space of the academy is not open, does not have equal access, or if there's no substantive equality within this space, what value does the freedom of the ones that have access to this space, what value can we really give it if in the sense of, if not everyone has access in the same way to this sphere, if that's clear. And thinking about redefining academic freedom as by foregrounding the obligations of epistemic justice and social responsibility, I also wanted to think about the methods of the students that have been very divisive, of not platforming, the demands of what you spoke of canceling an event, canceling speakers, etc. And I, in my chapter, attempted to give sort of a very measured defense of these methods. And I do want to sort of distinguish the method of not platforming and what is often referred to as cancel culture. Because I think that these two should be conceptually separated, even if they seem to always be combined, in the sense that I think that non-platforming can be defended in a way that call-out culture is harder to defend. And non-platforming, I think, in a way, and this also runs parallel to some of what Jacob Levy was speaking of earlier, I think it's important to see that students can also be valid contributors to defining disciplinary standards, and in as much can see if a speaker has or doesn't have credibility to speak about an event, have a valid claim to ask that the speaker not speak in this discipline. And I think that in this way, that not platforming, simply the demand for someone to not speak and not be given credibility, is part of a defining of academic standards that is done by the community as a whole, including students. So in that way, I thought that non-platforming could be defended, whereas calling out culture in its sort of transitive, the way it's often sort of contaminates anyone who has anything to do with that speaker, or the way it sees things that's very dualistic, like wrong or good. I think that is, that would not be part of what I defend as non-platforming. And I think that's it. So yeah, I just wanted to, in this chapter, sort of try and rethink of the method of non-platforming and also how to understand academic freedom as really carrying obligations of social responsibility that should not only be seen as vested in the administration or the institution as a whole, but also in individual professors' work.
Thank you. And thank you for saying within the time. And that gives us actually a little more time for discussions. We have, as I mentioned, a hard stop at 4:30 and even actually a little before that because Nandini unfortunately has also another engagement. So I don't know if any of you, I'm going to start with the panel. If there's anybody on the panel that wants to react to what other panelists have said. And I'm thinking, no, you want to give the word to the audience. So then word to the audience is given. So, est-ce que des gens dans la salle qui auraient des questions? As you can see, English or French, en français, en anglais. It's really as you wish. Puis Sylvain est à l'arrière, prend les questions en ligne. So if you're watching us through Zoom and you have a question, just type it into the discussion box and Sylvain will ask it. Are there any questions online currently already? No. Est-ce que dans la salle, il y a des questions? Pour la première qui est la plus difficile.
I actually have a question for both Sophie and Tamara. So the distinction between non-platforming and cancel culture. And this is really standard. So I think it is not about standards. It is about differences of opinion. It's not about access. So sometimes speakers who are invited, they have endorsement from the disciplinary community. They're, as he said, published in all the peer-reviewed journals, pleaded in front of international courts, but their views don't align with certain student groups. And I think the plural community which we have, and it's about communities, university in itself, different sets of groups can invite different people. And hold those events in a fashion which fits in with an academic space for robust exchange in ideas. We don't have to agree upon, in fact, even in a small faculty of law, I mean, different little units invite different people. And not necessarily we all agree with what has been said or they are hosted by different colleagues. We choose to go, not to go, agree or not to agree. But that distinction for me is not clear. And that distinction, unfortunately, is not clear in student communities right now. And even within, as I said, balkanization of concerns and ideas, even students don't agree. So the student groups, as you know, are not a monolith, right? Students, there's nothing like that anymore. Even within a student association, and to give you an example of Jewish Law Student Association, there is so much diversity within that. and people are not able to agree upon absolutely anything. And some are really in a state of trauma with what the other half is trying to do. So I wasn't sure, and I don't think that I have a question as such, but this was immediately what jumped to me.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of a, I agree with you that the distinction is so blurry that I think it's possible to defend non-platforming in a theoretical sense, but in a practical sense, when it always happens with calling out culture and sort of, or a calling, I don't want to use the term culture because that already creates a negative like view of it, but I think that yeah, the sort of canceling and restricts the public space, restricts the space for discourse, and ultimately I view it as a bad thing of how, and I agree with you that it's like rare to see it to see a sort of very civil non-platforming. Oh, but would you mind not having this speaker? You spoke about the emails you're receiving that where the tone is becoming more and more aggressive or strident, and so I think that it's difficult to. I think that maybe if yeah, I don't know if maybe if it happens if the discussions would happen at a much earlier point. I think that we could see a non-platforming that could be more distinguished from canceling, if perhaps. But I agree with you that it's two phenomena that happen kind of hand in hand, and it makes it really difficult.
Pour moi, la notion de cancel culture, c'est une notion qui est aussi utilisée pour des fins très politiques. Alors, il faut faire aussi attention à la façon dont on parle de cancel culture, parce que souvent, ce qu'on essaye de faire, c'est aussi de taire certaines voix par ce mécanisme-là. Alors ça, pour moi, c'est un danger, mais en même temps, quand on regarde un peu je ne sais pas si c'est dans quoi que j'ai lu ça récemment, mais comment, par exemple, les politiciens ont utilisé les universités pour faire passer certaines idées qui n'ont pas de fondement théorique. Il y a aussi cette affaire-là. Donc, c'est un moment qui est complexe. Et en même temps, il faut, je pense, se rattacher à certaines valeurs qui doivent être fondamentales, qui doivent quand même être celles qui sont déterminées, dans le fond, maintenir la dignité du plus grand nombre possible. Et il y a certaines discussions qui on le voit aujourd'hui, qui nous amènent dans des sphères qu'on n'aurait pas imaginées il y a longtemps, sous le couvert du free speech. Alors, je pense que pour moi, c'est ce que je vois.
Je vous ai entendu. Est-ce que vous aviez...
Non, j'étais juste d'accord. Enfin, un des problèmes, c'est on a une culture ex-post de réponse, souvent à des événements dont le principe a déjà été décidé et qui met tout le monde dans des situations très complexes. Et que bon, il y a sûrement quelque chose à faire en termes de gouvernance des universités et d'inclusion dans la conception des syllabus, des programmes académiques, etc., de consultation. Ça ne veut pas dire que ça lie les professeurs, etc., mais c'est des questions mais la liberté académique comme quelque chose d'exercer à plusieurs et d'exercer collégialement, je pense que c'est un peu ce que disait Jacob, c'est-à-dire finalement, en fait, le terme liberté est un peu trompeur, parce que ce n'est pas vraiment une liberté, c'est une forme d'autonomie, et la liberté renvoie dans le jargon libéral classique souvent à quelque chose d'individuel. Or, en fait, la liberté académique, c'est plutôt un bien public qui définit la manière dont une communauté, qui inclut les chercheurs, les enseignants, mais aussi les étudiants, décident de s'autodéterminer. Et ça, c'est donc la liberté, c'est la liberté de l'université par rapport aux tentatives de la réguler de l'extérieur. Et c'est moins une prérogative individuelle et impérieuse de chacun de faire ce qu'il veut. Ça, c'est un peu la vulgarisation des libertés. Voilà.
si je peux me permettre juste très rapidement. Et aussi, j'ai l'impression que ce dont moi j'ai également été témoin dans les communautés étudiantes, justement de cette polarisation politique extrême suite au 7 octobre. Je ne sais pas comment le concept de liberté académique peut suffire à répondre aux questions qui émergent de cette confrontation entre les étudiants, de voir les guerres de posters, dans les couloirs, je veux dire, la violence verbale utilisée en ligne, tout ça, j'ai l'impression que le concept de liberté académique, en fait, ne suffit plus à expliquer ou à offrir des solutions pour que faire de ce vitriol par rapport à des questions politiques, des conflits politiques, je veux dire, donc, je ne sais pas quel autre concept, mais j'ai l'impression qu'il y a comme un mismatch. Si on met tout ça en dessous du chapeau de la liberté académique, je ne vois pas comment ce concept peut offrir tellement de solutions à cette polarisation sur les campus.
Alors, cette fois-ci, sur ces propos, je vous remercie une fois de plus. Donc, merci à nos panélistes. Merci à vous tous de vous être joints à nous. The book is called Academic Freedom. We heard about 4 of the chapters plus the introduction. There's actually another 18 chapters to read. I don't get a cut of this, but I'm still going to say, go get yourself a copy, and it's great.
Open access, don't get access.
Oh, well, get an online copy, Seth.
Please do not buy.
Good afternoon, everyone.